or anything that you really want to research, just to dive in and find out everything you possibly can about it. But this is likely where mistakes are going to be made, or where you're going to start repeating research, looking at the same things over again. And so it's really important to have a research question. And this will help you focus in on what you're researching and prevent repetitive research, which we've all done. You go in thinking you're researching a new resource, and instead you realize you've researched it already. So with the research question, you want to focus on who do you want to research? It's not? Okay, hold on. Sorry, I just realized my slides are not sharing, so let me start this again. Gotta love technical issues. Okay, can everybody see my slides now? Give a nice little yes in the chat for Laura. Let's make them bigger. Okay, there we go. Research questions. All right. So again, the research question is where you want to start. And you really want to make the research question specific. You don't want it to be a really generic of where do I find all the information about John Smith. You want it to be who are the parents of John Smith, born in Loudoun County, Virginia. You're not always going to know dates about a person. That may be what you're trying to figure out. What is the birth date of John Smith, born in Loudoun County, Virginia? You may not know where they're born. That may be what you're trying to find out. But you want to include as much of the information you do know about the person, because you want to be able to distinguish them from anyone else who has the same name or the same identifying features as them. Because the likelihood is, as you all know, you're going to have people that you're researching that have the same names. So by including locations or dates or relatives names in those research questions, it helps you identify the specific person that you're researching. And then you can identify who they are when you look at that research question and all the research that you're noting under that research question. Thomas Jones, in his book, Mastering Genealogical Proof, which is a great resource to figure out research questions, says that your research question should either be looking for a relationship, an event, or you're trying to identify something about someone. And so those are the kind of things you want to look for, and you want to make sure they're as specific as possible. So making sure that question has something to distinguish your person from someone else. And when you're with your research question, again, it's being specific. So what do you want to know? Are you looking for something about the person, their parents, their spouse, their children? Are you looking for where they were born, where they died? Are you looking for an event about them, when they were born, or something else about them? And then including what you already know. Names, if you're researching a woman, include their Banin name. Dates, locations. Another really important thing to include when forming a research question is their race, because that influences records that we can go look at, methodologies in research. So you want to include what you know. Again, understanding you may not know everything, that's why you're researching them. So your research question may change as you research them. And that's what's fun about research. Your research question starts your research plan. And this is what helps you avoid the repetition. It guides your research, and your research plan can be whatever format you want. It's to guide your research. But research plans, the basic ones, will have 5 key components. Your research question, what's your objective? What's your purpose? The information you already know, and there may be a lot of information you already know, there may be a little information. The working hypothesis that you're kind of going with. So if you think you know where they were married, but you want to confirm where they were married, you can put that in. Possible sources that you're going to look at. So if you think that they were married in Baltimore, Maryland, then you're going to start with resources in Baltimore, Maryland, and you're going to go from there. And then you're going to lay out the steps of the research plan. I'm going to start with the resources in Baltimore, Maryland for the years that I think that they were potentially married there. And if those don't work, I'm going to go out from there. And in the steps of your research plan, also include the repositories that you will want to visit or contact. And another helpful thing in steps of a research plan is if you don't find the information that you're looking for in your initial resources or repositories, do you have backups? Where are you going to go next? And the thing about a research plan is it's probably going to change as you conduct your research. So it's a fluid document. And that's why the format, use what works for you. Does a pre-designed form work for you? Does an outline work best? A lot of people like some use like bullet journaling. You can really do whatever you want with a research plan because it's for you. So however your brain works, that's how your research plan should fit. And the research plan will flow right into your research log. And this is where you keep track of what you research, where you find it, when you did that research, and any other aspects of the research process that keep you from repeating that research. And again, your research log can take any format you wish, as long as it helps you keep track of your research. So if you want to mirror the format of your research plan in your research log, then you can do that. If you want completely different formats, do that. You want to make sure you have the name of the ancestor you're researching, where and when you researched, and you want to be specific. So don't just say, I went to ancestry.com and I searched and I didn't find anything. You want to make sure that you mention the specific collections on ancestry.com that you searched, the specific date that you did the search, and the keywords you searched for. What name combinations did you use? Did you search in specific states within that collection? And the reason for this is that those collections change all the time. And so if you have a specific date and then an announcement comes out that they added to that collection, you know that you haven't searched that collection since they made those additions. So you can go and do a search again and see if there are new things added in that collection because you have that specific date. So the dates that you did the search are really important, as are the specific collections and the keywords, because if you go and do other research and you discover that on some other records, the person you're researching has used a different spelling of a first or last name, you can go back to another resource and do another search with those new spellings because you have all the keywords that you use to search and you know that you didn't use those spellings before. You want to make a note, did you find anything? And if you did find anything, cite those sources. Write the citations out as you go, and we'll talk about citations in a minute. Also make a note if you didn't find anything. Because if you don't write down where you didn't find anything, you may go search it again. So again, make a date. I didn't find anything. So then you're not searching the collection again. But at the same time, if they add to that collection, you can go back and search it and see if they've added anything. And then you can also make notes of anything you want to remember. So if you're searching, and it's really important just to search one person at a time, although we all love the rabbit holes. And there's nothing wrong with rabbit holes, but you want to make sure you keep focused. But if you get inspired and you think of future research questions or other places or people or records or anything you want, you can make notes of that in the research log too. So there are pre-templated research logs, and there are lots of different kinds that you can find online. This is one from Family Search, and so there are forms you can fill out. You don't need to start from scratch. but you can start from scratch. Everybody has a preference. And so you can see the ancestors right at the top, the birth and death date. They're writing down where they've researched, the date they researched, what specifically they were looking for in that resource. Right? Are you looking for a marriage date? Are you looking for a spouse? Are you looking for a child? They have the source and they have the full citation and they have what they found. Did they find anything? And down at the bottom, they wrote their full research question. So they knew exactly what they were looking for. And they have a suggestion that, this is where you should look for that. So these are the kind of things that you should be writing down in your research log. And for the research logs, everybody kind of has different ways that they do it, but it's really helpful if you keep all your research for each individual person you're researching in one place. Some people have a notebook for each family line and then a section in each notebook for each person they're researching. So it all stays together. And so you can figure out what works for you. And you'll get used to it. But these are things you absolutely will want to do. It'll keep your research organized, and you'll kind of get into the groove of it before you dive into more advanced research. These are just some helpful resources on research logs and research questions and research plans, to kind of give you ideas of what to do as you're figuring out what works for you. Are there any questions on just this initial starting your research? And if you think of some along the way, sure.
Norah, we do have a question from Tammy who asks, can you have multiple questions for one research plan, or do you have a research plan for each research question?
That's a great question. You should have one research question for each research plan. So a research plan does not have to be extensive. It can be a page, right? It can be real straightforward. So it's one research plan for one research question. And if your research question changes, then you just need to tweak your research plan a little bit. So if you are just looking for the birth date of somebody, and that's your research question, then that's your research plan. And then you just go from there. And it's just a really straightforward, this is where I'm going to look, this is where I'm going to go. And if you don't have a working kind of hypothesis, don't worry about it. But it's helpful if you have some idea of where you should kind of lay out a plan of the resources that you want to look at. But one research plan for each research question. And each research question should have one specific goal in mind. So when you're starting your research, you want to start with what you know. Start with yourself and work backwards. Start with one family name, work on one ancestor at a time. And the records that you want to start with are the vital records, so birth, marriage, death, and then your census records. Those 4 record sets will give you the information that you need on the person you're researching to then move into the more detailed records that we're going to talk about today, that you can kind of fan out and get more information. So this is where you want to start, once you have that research question, once you have those research plans in place, start with the vital records and the census records and then move from there. So these are just some helpful resources on working with census records and vital records. And yes, all of this will be available to you, so you don't need to be frantically writing down the resources. You will get copies of these afterwards. So I want to talk a little bit about the genealogical proof standard known as the GPS. Not like driving in your car, but kind of like driving your research. This is something that professional genealogists follow when they are presenting research for clients. It's put out by the genealogy standards text, which has all of the standards for the genealogical proof standard, is put out by the Board for Certification of Genealogists, which is the board that if you want to become a certified genealogist, you would submit your portfolio to. They're also accredited genealogists, which is through another organization and is a different process. Those are the two, you're certified or accredited. So with the genealogical proof standard, it is the process through which you think about your research, the steps you go through. And you do not need to be a professional genealogist to think about these steps. Everyone who's conducting research, you're doing this. It's a reasonably exhaustive search, which essentially means, have you looked at all of the resources available to you that could potentially answer your question? So it doesn't mean you have to look at every single resource, because that's impossible, but every single one available to you. So it is understood that if you were researching a family in Poland, you may not be able to access the records in the Polish repositories. But have you done everything possible to access the records you can access? And that's a reasonably exhaustive search. You want to make sure that you have accessed every single resource available to you to address any conflicting evidence, anything like that. So that's the reasonably exhaustive search. This includes online research and in-person repositories, because there are in-person repositories here in the US that do have international records. So understanding you may not be able to travel overseas, but you have done both, right? Complete and accurate source citations. We'll talk more about citations in a minute, but they're so important. You need to be able to provide complete, correct citations for all of the sources that you're using so that someone else could look at those citations and go find that source and go find the reference in the source that you've given. So thorough analysis and correlation. You need to be able to not only present the resources, but also analyze the information from the multiple resources and correlate it so that someone can look at the information you've given and say, yes, it's very obvious that this person was born here. Right? The documents that this person is presenting, they've analyzed those documents and the information in those documents, and it all correlates together. They've done that. Resolution of conflicting evidence. Some of the documents and resources you find may provide evidence that does not match up. And as someone presenting your research, you need to have resolved that evidence. And if you're not able to resolve that evidence, you need to be able to explain why you weren't able to resolve it. And it's very rare that you'll see research published that hasn't been resolved, but if you are doing research for your family or you're doing research for a friend or a client, and you need to at least be able to explain why it hasn't been resolved yet. And if you're not able to resolve it, you need to kind of give them a mini research plan of what the next steps are to try and resolve it. And then a soundly written conclusion based on the strongest evidence. So this is the evidence you found, you've analyzed and correlated it, you've dealt with the conflicting evidence, and this is what you've concluded to answer your research question. So the analysis and correlation, the conflicting evidence, the conclusion, everything in the GPS goes back to your research question. And it goes back to that research plan. And that's why the research question and the research plan and the research log are so important, because it all ties back to that. Have you answered your research question? Have you addressed anything that could be conflicting with your research question? Are there resources that give an opposing answer to what you're saying the answer is to your research question? And it all goes back to the research question. And so the genealogy standards that the Board for Certification of Genealogists has put out address every one of the 5 steps of the GPS, and it helps you work through your research, and it helps you say the information that I've conducted is sound and it's accurate, and it's something that you should be thinking about as you're forming your research questions and you're forming your research plan, and as you're working through the documents. So these are just some really helpful resources if you want to learn more about the genealogical proof. And the Board for Certifications of Genealogists also has a website that kind of talks about it more if you're ever interested in pursuing certification. Citations. Citations are incredibly important. Citing everything you find, all your sources. The genealogical citation format is based off of the Chicago style of citations, which can be found in the Chicago Manual of Style. That is a typo. It's the Chicago Manual of Style. But Elizabeth Shown Mills took the Chicago Manual of Style and said, this is not specific enough for genealogy. It doesn't address all of the very nuanced documents that genealogists use, and it doesn't work. And she produced Evidence Explained, which is a book that focuses on all of the different documents that genealogists and family historians use in their research. And so it details the vital records and the census and the land records and the military records, and it discusses the nuances that you will run into with these records and how to properly cite them so that you can go back and find them, someone else can go back and find them. The most important thing to do is cite as you go. Use your research log to keep track of them. Because the worst thing is you found this great source and you traveled a long distance to a repository, you found the key source. It explains everything. It's the source that broke your brick wall. And it's great. And you took all these notes, you got all the information, you go back home and you're writing up everything, and you realize that you didn't write down the citation. So you don't know what archival collection it came from. You don't know what box it came from in that collection, what folder it came from. You don't know. And so you can't write a citation for it. And you have to like backtrack it. Or even worse, you find all this great information, you leave it for a few months, a few years, however long you have to leave it. You come back however long later, and you have absolutely no idea where that information came from. Cite as you go, write it. And my recommendation is you write the source list, the bibliography format, and the footnote endnote format, so you have both. And Evidence Explained does that, so they give you both versions of each so that it's all just there and you don't have to worry about it. Because the successful citation is going to allow anyone reading it to be able to go back and find that source and the specific reference in the source. But the most important person it's going to help is you. And so as you can see, I've put up an example of a full citation. This is for an 1850 US Census. It just so happens to be a Loudoun County one. This is a footnote version, so it's a not a source list. It's a footnote for an 1850 US Census found on Ancestry. what's really interesting about this one is that it is sourcing residents that live in a house that is not theirs. So you can see that there's a sentence after the citation saying that the residents being researched are these people and these are the lines they appear on, right? Because in the citation itself, it's saying, you know, it's the household of Catherine Beneman, but the people being researched are William and John Rollins. And so what you can see from this is that a person doing research for this would be able to go to Ancestry. They'd be able to say it's the 1850 US Census, it's Loudoun County, it's page 306 of this census, it's dwelling number 2101, it's family number 2101, and it's the Catherine Beneman household, and then it's lines 27 and 29 in that census. Furthermore, the original image is National Archives microfilm, and it's this publication and it's this roll. So it's a dual citation of this is where it can be found online and this is where it can be found originally. And that is something you need to be aware of when you are citing things that can be found online. You have to cite where they're found online and where they're found originally. And that is usually information that if you're using Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Search, they will provide that information for you if you read the description of the collection, which you should always read the description of the collection because that's where it will tell you where they came from, whether they came from the National Archives, a state archive, a county archive, whether they are reproductions from microfilm, reproductions from original books. And those are important things to note because if the collection gets pulled from Ancestry or pulled from Family Search or pulled from MyHeritage or pulled from Heritage Quest, then they know where the original is and they can track it that way. Be wary of citation software. Citation software is very popular. You type the information into a form, it auto-populates your citation. Or you go to a website and you click on citation and it auto-formulates a citation for you. They're not always accurate, especially if you're submitting for school or portfolios or something like that. They're not always the format they're looking for. So just always double back and edit those, compare them to Evidence Explained or the Chicago Manual of Style. Citations take a lot of time, they take a lot of thought, but if you do them up front and you do them right the first time, you can go back and like template them. So once you have a census footnote done, there are some differences between some of the census ones change based on the year. But if you use like the 1920 census a lot, once you have a 1920 footnote written, you can just stick in the information, the template's done. The same is true for birth records and marriage records and land records. Like once you have a template going for a source you use all the time, you can just have a template going. So what I have is anytime I type up a citation for a record type, I have a Word document and I just put that record type in there with like a heading that it's the 1850 US Census, and then I have the citation that I typed in there, and then if I down the road have to type up a footnote for another 1850 US Census, I just pull up like my citation examples, and I have the template ready to go, and I just stick my information in there. Because I've already pulled how to do it from Evidence Explained. But Evidence Explained doesn't have everything. So sometimes you actually have to take what Evidence Explained has and figure out what works best for your source, and do some research and kind of figure out how to design it yourself. But if you learn how to do it, it will take you places. So these are some resources for citations. Evidence Explained. On the previous slide, it was their website. Chicago Manual of Style. again, the previous slide was their website, and then a couple others. Any questions on the genealogical proof standard or citations? Again, like that was the briefest discussion on citations. I could do a whole class on that alone, but I know I just overwhelmed you all with citations. So now we're going to talk about some fun things. Cluster research, the fan network. So when you are doing kind of your initial research with people, you're just focusing on that one person, their spouse, their kids, their parents, maybe their siblings. And then you just go back in the generations. So grandparents and then the next generation. When you start getting further into the research, you've been doing it for a while, you maybe start hitting some brick walls and you just can't get any further and you're stuck. That is when cluster research or the fan network can come in handy. Fan is friends, associates, and neighbors. Sometimes you'll see it as friends, acquaintances, and neighbors. People have different ways of defining fan. This is really helpful when you're trying to track someone and you're just stuck. You can't find them, or you can't figure out their next step. So you thought that they were in a location and they're not. So you think maybe they went to another location, or you just can't trace them back. And basically what it is you kind of hit the end of the line with the family and you need to look somewhere else. So you look in their fan network. Who were their friends? Who were their associates? Who were their neighbors? And this will give you an idea of like who is in their everyday life. Those names will allow you to kind of track where they went and what they were doing. So on census records, it's really tempting to just look at the household where your person was and just look at their name and their families and nothing else. But on census records, in city directories, tax records, land records, look for people with the same surname on the same page. Sometimes you'll look at a page in a census record and every single household will have the same last name. Well, are they related? They may not be, but are they? It's likely they could be. Um, are there other households with the same name? Also, does every household on that block have the same occupation? That's a big giveaway that they're connected. Um, start looking for that. Or if you're in a household and it looks like, if you're looking at a household and there are 20, 30 names in there, it could be an apartment building. So start looking for that. So just start looking for clues. Look for the page before in the census record, the page after in the census record. Are there people with the same surnames? Clues like that. Same with the city directories. The city directories are either going to be organized by street or by last name, and we'll look at some examples later. Look for the other people with the last names. They're not always going to be related, but they may be, and those you may be able to research those people. If you're having a really hard time trying to figure out parents and you just can't connect them, start researching siblings. But just start tracking other people. Look at ship manifests for people coming from the same area and going to the same area. They may not always have the same surname, but if you're looking at a ship manifest and you see a really large group of people that are coming from the same village and they have the same final destination, that is very telling, especially if they're coming into the same port, but they're not staying there. Right? So it'd be really common for a lot of people coming into like Ellis Island or Baltimore to put New York or Baltimore as their final destination because they don't know where they're going. But if you look at a ship manifest and you have a really large group of people that are all coming from the same small village in Italy and they're not staying in New York, but they're going to another town in like Ohio, that tells you something. You're going to want to follow that group if the person you're researching is in that group. Because that's going to say something about the area they came from and the area they're going. Look in church and cemetery records for people with the same surname, because that could be a family group that you're going to want to track. Especially with church records like baptism records and wedding records, because you'll be looking for like godparents and witnesses at those ceremonies. Even if they don't have the same last name, if they've been chosen to be godparents for baptisms, that tells you that that person is important and you can use them to do research on your person. So in your research logs, you will want to document names of witnesses and godparents and business partners that appear on the documents. Some of them may not be important at all. Sometimes they would just pull witnesses from like the local taverns because they were there. So you'll be looking at like court documents and deeds and things like that, and you'll just see the same witnesses on everything. But other times they're really important. They were brought by the person to be a witness. So they're significant to that person and you want to record them. Catherine Wilson, who runs social media genealogy, has a fan club spreadsheet, and it lists all of the different events and types of documents that you may see someone in a fan network that you would want to write down. And these are people that you would possibly use to track your person. If those names keep appearing together, then that means that they were connected and you can use them to track them. You know, did they open a business together? Were they neighbors? Did they, you know, if you're having a hard time finding a land record for your person that you're researching, but you know that this person kept appearing on all the census records next to them, then see if you can find the land records for that person that was on the census next to them, and then try to track the land records through them. Cluster research can be really fun. It can be a really interesting way to track your person, and then you get to research some different people. So it's a really, really fun way to do some research. And these are just some resources on cluster research. Elizabeth Schoen Mills really, really started the fan network. She like named it the fan network, and the cluster research. So she's done a lot of work on it. Everybody kind of has their different ways of doing it, and once you get into it, you'll figure out what's for you as well. But it works really well with a lot of the resources that we're going to talk about today. So I wanted to introduce it to all of you because it is, like I said, it's a really fun way to find some information on some of the people that you're researching that you may not have found before. So before we start talking about some specific types of records, any questions on anything we've talked about? All right, let's get into records. So these are just examples of some of the types of records that you may be using to do some of your research. I already mentioned the vital records and the census records, and today we are going to talk about some others. Again, Catherine Wilson on her social media genealogy website has a phenomenal American genealogical research checklist that basically outlines a whole large number of potential resources you should look at if you are researching someone in the United States. So I put that link in there because it is real helpful to make sure that you are not forgetting anything. So we are going to start with immigration and naturalization records. Here are some of the big records. This is not a be-all end-all list, but these are some of the ones that you may come across when you are looking at immigration and naturalization records. Passenger manifests. In addition to passenger manifests, there are also crew lists. Sometimes the crew lists are included with the passenger manifest, sometimes they are separate. Departing passenger and crew lists, so I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the UK has departing passenger and crew lists for like the end of the 19th, early 20th century. The US has it for a very small number of years in the late 19th century, but it's a very short number of years. The UK is really known for it. And this is anyone who is departing England. Naturalization records, so the Declaration of Intention, the petition for naturalization, and the oath of allegiance. So anyone who is applying for citizenship, those are the big three records that you're going to be looking for. Airplane manifests, this is one that a lot of people forget about. We're so focused on the ship manifest that we forget that the airplane manifests are available too. People had to fill out the cards, and you still do. So we've got the airplane manifest, border crossings. If you are crossing in, you have those, and then passports. And this is an example of an application for a passport in the United States in 1900. Now, here's the really interesting thing about the passport records in the United States that you're going to see in the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Some people filled out the form. Other people just wrote letters. So when you're looking through the passport records, you'll see the forms or you'll just see a letter to the Department of War or the Department of State saying, I need to travel. I was told I needed to contact you. Here's all my information. Here's where I'm going. Some of them are really long and detailed, basically including all of the information that's on the form. Some of them are 2 sentences. My name is so-and-so. I need to travel out of the country. Please send me a passport. So it's really interesting to see the different ways that people applied for passports in the United States. But you can get a whole lot of information from the passport applications because it is saying where they live, where they were born, if they came into the country, then it says when they came into the country, when they naturalized, where they naturalized. It also says their occupation, when they plan on going abroad, how long they plan on staying abroad. Some give more information than others. This one just says, I will return to the US when this passport expires. Others give specific, like, I'm going to be gone for 4 months. And then it gives a physical description of them. So you can get a whole lot of information from passport applications if they filled out the form. So these were the UK outward passenger manifests that I was telling you about. These are available on Ancestry. I know that the detail is really hard to read, but these are available for any ships departing the UK. Again, it's like the late 19th century, early 20th century, and they're available for coming to the US or going anywhere in like the British Commonwealth. So you can get them for Canada, South Africa, areas in the Pacific. And there's 2 parts to these passenger manifests. So on the left, you can see all of the British passengers. And on the right, you can see all of the alien or non-British passengers. And you can see that in the British passengers, it asks which country in Britain they're from. So England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and then it asks their last address and it asks where they're going. And then for the alien passengers, it asks what country they're a citizen of and where they're intending to go. So this ship is actually going to Canada. It is in 1939 May, and almost all of the alien passengers on this passenger manifest are citizens of the Czech Sudetenland. So in May 1939, they are all fleeing the Nazi regime. And so these outward passenger manifests are phenomenal because if you are not able to find who you're researching on an incoming US passenger manifest, but you suspect they may have left a UK port, if it fits into the time period of when you have these available outward passenger manifests, you can go see if they're on a UK outward passenger manifest. And sometimes you can get more information, like where their last address was. But one of the other things is that the UK was a stopover for a lot of passengers from Europe. So it will show like how long they were in England for their stopover. Was it really short? Was it really long? And it also helps with that conflicting evidence. If there's questionable information on their incoming US passenger manifest, if they have a UK outward passenger manifest, you can try to see if that information matches up or if you can resolve some of that conflicting evidence. So I really like this. It's really helpful if you can get them on it. So this is a passenger manifest of passengers coming in from Hamburg, Germany. And they're coming into New York. And one of the things I picked this one because one of the things that some people don't realize about the passenger manifest is that once you start getting into the like 20s, 30s, 40s, is the passenger manifest are 2 pages. This is 1928. And the second page has a lot of really helpful information. So the first page, you will have who they are, their occupation, their age, whether they're married, their nationality, where they were born, their visa number, where that visa was issued, when it was issued, their last permanent residence. You can also see families grouped together. So Paul Blankenhorn, which is line 8, he's coming over with his wife Elizabeth and his daughter Gisela. Those quotes mean it's the same last name. That's almost a really easy way to start identifying family groups. And then on the second page, you can see they need to give the name of a relative from the country they came from, and it will tell the relationship. So was it a sister? Was it a mother? Was it a father? Was it an aunt? They have to give their final destination. So this is what I was talking about. They're coming into New York, but Paul and his family are going to Alexandria, Virginia. All right. Okay, that's interesting. And they're going to meet his brother in Alexandria, Virginia. You get a physical description of them. So there's a ton of helpful information on that second page. And if you miss that second page, you miss, relatives back home. That can help you track back to the home country. You miss where they're coming in here. So if somebody didn't see this second page and didn't realize that the Blankenhorns were going to Virginia and they tried to find them in New York, they wouldn't find them in New York. So you have them on a passenger manifest. Ooh, is there a question? Go
Yes,
back
there
to
is a question. Sorry.
No, it's okay. There's a question. Let's go back to the passenger manifest.
Okay, and this is sort of a general question, but it's a good one. Anne would like to know, when do manifest passport applications become available? Is it safe to assume that only info online for these is for people who are deceased and that there is no current information available?
So, the passenger manifest and passport information usually stops. there's not like a hard like date deadline. It's not like the privacy dates that you see with like individual states and counties, where there's like the 72 years or 100 years. You see those a lot, or with the census where it has to be so many years after the census is done. A lot of this, so when you're dealing with immigration services, it gets very complicated. Some of that we will see. I will talk about it. Actually, I'm gonna where to look for naturalization records. It gets very complicated because um, there was a shift in who was doing naturalization records from like the local to the federal. Um, Pretty much all of the Ellis Island passenger manifests are available online, because once Ellis Island closed down, um, and I am blanking, that was 19 post World War II. It closed down like shortly after World War II. Can you Google it real quickly? Yeah, Laura's gonna Google it because it literally just like 1943 is when Ellis Island closed down. So those passenger manifests for coming into Ellis Island are all available online. Um, you're not going to be able to find like your passport application online, because that process has shifted. Um, the naturalization records, like the petitions and the intents, I have found them up through like the 40s, maybe into the early 50s. And they do that, like, could they possibly still be alive? Um, you can submit requests to immigration services, and it's ICE. It's the same, it's all the same immigration services. They have a genealogy department and historic records department, and you can request specific records. You can request the declaration of intent, the petition, all of that. You can also request um, other records associated with them coming into the country and being in the country, but you have to prove that they are deceased. If you cannot prove they are deceased, um, they will not give you records. And it's kind of a two-part process. You submit a request for a search, um, and then they'll do a search. And if they find anything, then you submit a request for the records. If you have specific numbers, like certificate numbers and things like that, you can skip over the search and you can just say, like, I want the certificates. Um, but there's a very specific process which they discuss on their website. There's a very specific process for genealogical research, as opposed to I came into the country and I've lost my certificate. I need that. They're two separate processes. Um, so most of like the early port records, Baltimore, Boston, San Francisco, Ellis Island, for like the early 20th century are available online. And then for like later ones, if you can prove that person is deceased, you can get them. Sometimes they will ask you to prove relationship, like prove kin. Um, and sometimes they will deny it if they do not feel that you have satisfactorily proved that that person is deceased. Um, so you do not need, you know, your passport application is not available online. There are passenger, if you came over as a very young child in the 30s or 40s, you were probably on a passenger manifest online. So I hope that answers the question. It's it 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 the process to get naturalization records from immigration services is not easy. They've made it difficult because there is so much information um online. or on those records that they do not want to put it online. But because people came over in like the 30s and 40s and 50s as young children, they could be on those passenger manifests that are online and they could still be alive. Tied to that question, where do you look for naturalization records? So before September 27th, 1906, any court of record could grant United States citizenship. So municipal, county, state, federal, you could go to any court near you and get citizenship. So people would go to the court closest to them. So if you're looking for naturalization records before 1906, you need to research what courts were located closest to where the person lived. And then the trickier thing about that is that a person could live in Illinois when they filed a declaration of intent, and they could move to New York and file their petition for naturalization. So those records could be in different courts. So if you are researching a person and you know their declaration of intent was in one location, but you cannot find their petition for naturalization in that location, you need to figure out whether they moved. And they may not have moved states, they may have just moved counties. So you need to research different counties for those records, because it's not like now where we can just up and drive anywhere. They're going to go to the court that is closest to them, because it could take them all day to go to the court that is closest to them. After September 27, 1906, only federal courts could grant United States citizenship. However, that transfer took a while. So if it's after that date and you're looking for naturalization records and you cannot find them in the federal records, look at the county and state level. And this goes to the mid 20th century, because it really did take a while for the process to completely transfer to the federal courts. So there are a couple of different places you need to look for naturalization records before 1906 and then in the transfer process. And not all of them are online. There is an index. So there is a database index where you'll see like a little card that says this person was naturalized on this day in this district, but not all of the districts have digitized their records. And another thing is, so Ancestry and Family Search both have naturalization records. And some of them overlap and some of them don't. So if you don't find them on one, search the other. But the interesting thing is that some of them do overlap. And I have found, for some reason, Family Search has the photos on the records and Ancestry doesn't. And then sometimes Ancestry has the photos and Family Search doesn't. So I encourage people to search both, because two people that I was looking for, I found the records on Ancestry, and then I was searching another collection on Family Search, and I found the same exact records, but their photos were on the records on Family Search. And it's just really cool to see the photos. And if I had just said, oh, well, I found these records, I don't need to keep searching anymore, I never would have found the photos. And these are what they will look like. So the Declaration of Intention is on the left, the petition for naturalization on the right. This is our good friend Paul Blankenhorn, who came from Germany into Ellis Island and then traveled down to Alexandria, Virginia, because that's where his brother was. We can see that when he files his Declaration of Intention, he and his wife had another child. So he came into the country in 1929, and he files his Declaration of Intention in 1932. So you do have to wait. There is a waiting period to declare your intent to naturalize. And then there's another waiting period before you can petition for your naturalization. And they did have to get you had to get affidavits of witnesses proving that you were who you said you were, and that you lived where you said you were, and that you did your occupation, and that they knew you were a good person. the reason these records are so great is that it gives where they currently lived, it gives their occupation, it gives a birth date, it gives where they were born, when they came into the country, the ship they came into the country on, and their spouse and their children. So if you are trying to track people back over to the home country, it gives a whole lot of information. Um, and if you're also trying to figure out, where they lived in the country, once they got here, it's also very helpful. There's a whole lot of information on these. Notice that, this is 1932, so he is filing in the United States District Court, Eastern District of Virginia. So this is a federal filing. It is post 1906. And that both of these are done in that same district. That's why it's so great once it all transfers to federal, because, unless they move, and there is still a possibility that they will move between declaration and petition, you can find them in the same group. I'm not going to go over all of these, but I wanted to include them so you would have them when you get the PowerPoint after the class. There are some really important naturalization laws that will impact your research when you are trying to figure out who could come into the country, who could come into the country, when they could apply, when they couldn't. The first Naturalization Act in the United States was in 1790. That stated those who had resided in the United States for 2 years and had their current state of residence for 1 year could apply for citizenship. However, it only applied to free white persons of good moral character. The 14th Amendment in 1868 provided citizenship for former slaves. And then in 1870, naturalization eligibility was extended to individuals of African nativity and descent, but it explicitly excluded any other non-white immigrant. And then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States for 10 years. It was renewed in 1892 for 10 years and then renewed in 1902 with no end date until it was repealed in 1943. The Expatriation Act of 1907 was one of the most important immigration acts to be passed and will probably impact your research very significantly. It stated that any US born woman who married a non-US citizen loses their American citizenship. And it's really important because the assumption by the United States government was that these women would automatically gain the citizenship of their husband's country, but that entirely depended on the laws of the husband's country, and most of the husband's countries had laws that stated those women could not become citizens, or some of those husbands came from countries where they lost their citizenship for marrying American women. So you then had couples who were stateless and had no citizenship. And that then impacts them in the United States and it impacts their children. So that law will impact your research quite substantially. And then the Immigration Act of 1917 is when we get a literacy requirement for immigrants. 1921 is when the national immigration quotas are established. You will start seeing this a lot when you're doing research for immigrants. It establishes quotas based on the number of foreign-born residents of each nationality who lived in the United States. It's initially based on the 1910 federal census, but as it gets renewed, because notice it's an emergency quota act, they will change which census it is. And the government basically chooses the census that has the nationalities that they want to allow into the country. So this plays a significant role in World War II on who they let in. The Cable Act of 1922 restores citizenship to U.S. born women who married non-citizen men and lost their citizenship under the Expatriation Act. The next few are all having to do with quotas. And then in 1965, the quota system is banished. So if you have people coming in to the country between 1921 and 1965, or trying to come into the country between 1921 and 1965, immigration quotas are going to impact them, especially if they're coming from Eastern European countries, Asia, any Eastern Hemisphere country, Eastern Europe, anything like that. So that will play a role in your research, that the quotas played a significant role in people trying to get in, and also people not being sent back as well if they managed to get over, but then didn't have a quota visa. So it's important to understand the naturalization laws in the US, because if you're trying to figure out when someone came over, or why someone didn't, where someone went instead, before they could come into the US, the immigration laws probably played a role in that. So these are some helpful books on the immigration laws. I also included a really helpful website from the Pew Research Center that talks about the US immigration laws and how they've changed through history. It tracks it through a timeline. And then a link to the nationalization records from the National Archives, that talks about where you can find them and things like that. Any other questions on immigration and naturalization records? Okay. Military records. So there are lots of different types of military records: pension applications, pension payment records, draft registrations, service records, muster rolls, headstone applications, regiment records, bounty land warrant applications, and so many more. This is an example of a headstone application. This one's from Ancestry specifically. So um, people could apply for specific headstones for veterans. And you're probably thinking, why is this helpful? Well, you can see from the one I picked, sometimes people would apply for them with incorrect spellings of names, and they would be sent to the department, and the people would be looking for them, and the War Department would say, well, we can't find this person. And they would go do research and they would correct the spelling of the name. Or sometimes they would correct the company and the regiment or the rank. And so these headstone applications can be really, really helpful, because sometimes you may have been looking for the person under the wrong spelling, or you may have had the wrong regiment or company for the person, and the War Department has corrected it on the headstone application, and you can get the correct information. It will also tell you where this marker is going up, and so you can find out where they are buried. So lots of information on this very tiny headstone application. And what's really nice is you can see that the War Department did all these corrections in helpful red pencil, so it really stands out when they have had to make these corrections. And you can see that this person is buried in Shenandoah County, Virginia, and they were actually able to find the correct spelling of the name. So it's always very, very helpful. Sometimes they actually have the actual enlistment dates and discharge dates. This one's not as helpful because it doesn't, but usually you can find the enlistment dates and discharge dates as well, which is also very helpful. So these are examples of some Revolutionary War pension applications. This is for a soldier from Massachusetts. The application was complete. I'm giving some separate examples of different pages that are from it. These applications are available on Fold 3. The applications for most soldiers are available in their entirety. Now, the thing with pension applications is some have more than others. It depends just what was submitted for every soldier. But you can see that for this soldier, Daniel Talbot, not only do we have a submission from the Massachusetts district that he needs support, but we also have his affidavit that he wrote, and then we also have the payout of his pension. And we also have a lovely example of the double S handwriting that looks like an F. So some of the pension applications, you will have multiple affidavits. Some of them, you will see that they didn't get approval for a pension application. But the applications are really helpful because, again, it will say where they fought, what they fought, unit they fought in. You will see where they live when they submit the pension. It's really interesting for people that live in Maine when they submit their pension applications, but they fought in Massachusetts because Maine was part of Massachusetts at the time. And so that submission process is really interesting. So if you're researching people that may be in Maine, you have to look in Massachusetts for things as well. That's another thing to note. The pension applications for the Revolutionary War have a lot of information, and they are a great resource. Pension applications for the Civil War are also a great resource. War of 1812 are also a great resource. Another great resource for the Civil War are the Complete Military Service Records, or the CMSRs. And you can get information on these in two places, different amounts of information. The index and full records are available at fold3.com. The database to see if a person is even in a regiment and potentially has a complete military service record, or what regiment they were in, is available at the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors system, which is through the National Park Service. And it's a basic database for the complete military service record. So I want to show you kind of the different information you can get from both. This is for a soldier named George Buxton, who served in the 41st Infantry in Virginia. So on the left is the Soldiers and Sailors database from the National Park Service. And on the right are two excerpts from his complete military service record on Fold 3. So on the left in the Soldiers and Sailors database, you can see that you get his regiment. You can see what side he fought on. You can see his company, his rank when he went in, his rank when he went out. And you can see where the information is coming from. So the original microfilm and the role that it's available. And then on the right, you can see the actual scanned service record that's up on Fold 3. So if you're not sure what regiment they're in or where they fought, you can go to the Soldiers and Sailors database and you can search their name. And then you can get their regiment, and then you can go to fold3.com and you can go into that regiment and you can look for his service record. The front page of the service record will look like that first page. So it'll have his name and his company and his regiment, and then it'll have the cards that are included. And then this is just an example of one of the muster rolls that's included. So you'll see it'll say where he was enlisted, when, by whom he was enlisted. It'll say when he was last paid, and then it'll say for this time period whether he's present or absent. And on this day, George Buxton was absent, sick in the hospital. Other things that'll appear in the military service record: if they were taken as a prisoner of war, you'll have that information. If they were injured, you may have some of their medical information and hospital information. If they were killed in action, you may have some of that information. The complete military service record will differ depending on that soldier's experience. But they are very helpful if you are trying to track a soldier's Civil War experience. Some of them have more information than others. Now, one thing to be very careful of, I do this all the time, Fold 3 has the index and the complete records. So you want to make sure that you are actually searching in the complete military service records, because if you just click on the index, you will only get the first page. Again, I do it all the time because the titles of the collections look exactly the same, except the word index is in the index collection. And you don't realize you're in the index collection until you get there and it's only all first pages. But the records are really, really helpful if you can get them. And they are available for pretty much every state that was in the Civil War. I'm pretty sure every state has finally been digitized. And that's Confederate and Union. And almost all of the regiments are up at this point. They're doing a really good job of getting them all digitized. And if you come visit us at the Thomas Balch Library, we do have access to Fold 3 for you. Um, I would, I do not know what their access is to these right now, but I don't know what accessibility they have made to them since they've gone up on Fold 3. I can check for you though. So along those lines, let's talk about NARA. So NARA is the National Archives and Records Administration. They are where the United States military records are held. Records prior to World War I are held at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. Anything for the 20th century um, after that are held in St. Louis at the National Personnel Records Center. They have a very detailed website about what records are where and how to get them. It is not incredibly easy to get 20th century records because of privacy, but they will work with you. And unfortunately, there was a fire at the St. Louis archives, and so some records have been lost. But the National Archives has a phenomenal website. If you've not been there, I encourage you to go and just look around. And they have very detailed information on the website for each of the individual types of records they hold, on how to access them, what steps to take to access them, and what information you need to provide to get them. And they do have, again, similar to the immigration records, separate ways to get records for genealogy reasons, and if you're a military personnel trying to get your records. So that's very helpful. NARA is still catching up from the pandemic, so please do not flood them with requests at the moment because they are still catching up from the pandemic. But I do encourage you to go look around their website and get familiar with what they have because they are very, very helpful. They are working to digitize records and get them online, but there are certain records that are not digitized, and the only way to access them is to go to NARA in person. Draft registrations. Now, these are a set of records that have been completely digitized and are available online. World War I and World War II. The draft registration cards, they just finished those in, I want to say, the last year or two. They're completely online and available through ancestry.com and Fold 3. So these are really helpful because it tells you, one, did the person that you are researching have to register? And two, where are they living? It will also give you dates of birth, although the dates of birth on draft registrations not always reliable. So this is one of those things where you want to have corroborating evidence from another resource. It will give you the name and address of a person who will not always know their address. Now, sometimes this will be a relative, a parent, a sibling, or a wife. Sometimes it'll be an employer. So this is where that fan network really gets going. Like who is this person? It'll list their employee and their place of employment, and then there'll be a description of them on the back. So these are really, really helpful to know. But again, be wary of those birth dates. Um, as we know, some people definitely lied to get into those drafts. So the birth date on the draft registrations, you always want to corroborate with something else. But the draft registration cards are incredibly helpful. These are also ones where there are 2 pages. So make sure you get both pages. Also, there are some draft registration cards that got uploaded in like the wrong order. So for the draft registration collections, make sure you read the descriptions of them. They will specifically tell you what states got uploaded in the wrong order. So like the back of the card is with the wrong front. And they'll tell you how to make sure you get the right back with the right front in the collection description. So that's just another plug to make sure you read the collection descriptions before you dive into the collection. And then these are some helpful military record resources. Again, National Archives, they have a great page for genealogy research and military records to kind of walk you through how to do that. And then this was just a really brief overview on military records. I wish I could continue talking about them, but I want to get to some more record types for you. Any other questions on military records?
Hey, Nora. We did have a quick question. In the CMSR, are the U.S. colored troop records available? Do you know?
I know some of them are. I have seen some of them. Again, I don't know if all the regiments have been digitized yet, but I do know that some of the colored troops are available.
Great. And I know that, as you mentioned, it's available in Fold 3. Is there another way to access that, or is that pretty much the easiest way?
The CMSR's digitation is solely with Fold 3 at this
Okay.
point. But as I mentioned, we have access to it here at Thomas Balch. If you are not local to us, I encourage you to check with your local libraries to see if they have subscriptions to Fold 3 and the other databases that I've mentioned. A lot of libraries do have subscriptions to those, and you can access them with your local library card. Land records. So this is another one where it's a huge topic. All of the record types I'm talking about today, I could do a whole class on. So I'm just giving you a really brief kind of short introduction to it. But some of the different land records types you may run into are land grants, deeds, land tax and property tax records, survey plats. This is an example of a land deed that we have here on microfilm at the library. You can see they're real fun to read, but they give you a whole lot of information. And if you're trying to figure out where someone lived or where their property was, it's really helpful. Before we jump into it, here, what's the difference? What's a grant? What's a deed? What's a patent? All of these definitions come from E. Wade Hohn's book, Land and Property Research in the United States. I have his book information on the resource slide at the end of this. If you were delving into land and property research here in the United States, I definitely recommend taking a look at his book. It's incredibly helpful. So the big difference is a land grant is any land that's being distributed by the government. So state government, federal government, anything. If it's going from the government to someone else, that's a land grant. And the buyer is the grantor and the seller is the grantee. A land deed is between individuals. So if the government is giving an individual land, that's the land grant. If that individual then gives that, sells that land to another individual, you have the land deed. All right. So if you're doing research on a property, you may have, and you're going like all the way back, you may have multiple land deeds and a land grant. So you'll probably also have a land survey, which is done with the description of the property, and it's going to include all the aspects of it. The perimeter, any natural features, is there a pond, is there a river that goes through it, man-made obstacles, bordering properties, and then the land patent is the official title to the property, and it's kind of the final completion of the acquiring of the land. So in your research of a piece of property, you may see all 4 of these records. So this is an example of a land survey. And I put up another example of a full citation for you, just so you can see kind of the different information that's included in different types of um, record types and their citations. And this land survey comes from the Library of Virginia. They actually have the digital images of Virginia land patents and grants. It's a great resource. I definitely encourage all of you to go look at it if you are researching land, especially that land that came from Lord Fairfax and you're tracing land in that region. So you can see, unlike the deed, which was just all text, the land survey has a drawing of the property, right? And it's showing uh, borders and in measurements and things like that. So the information that you're getting on the land survey and you know, a grant and a deed, there may be some overlap and there may be some differences. And that's especially true of different land deeds, because as the years go on, the property may have changed size, the people living on the bordering properties probably changed, and that's why you want to trace those land deeds as far back as you can, because you're going to get different information and it's going to show the history of the property. And then this is an example of a land grant. So it looks very similar to a land deed. Again, the difference is this grant is coming from government to individual, and the deeds are between the individuals. And again, this land grant is from that database on the Library of Virginia. So land records are not only helpful in showing a history of a property, but they're also very helpful if you're researching people. It helps you figure out where they were and when. It's also very helpful if you're doing cluster research, because you're trying to figure out who they were around, who they were interacting with. Sometimes in land records, you will have a husband and wife listed together. So if you're trying to figure out who a spouse was, you can figure that out as well. And so you may get information in these land records that you weren't getting elsewhere. You can also use land records to corroborate information, and sometimes they're just really cool to read. It's also a really good way to practice reading your handwriting. And you, when you're trying to track movements of people, some families will buy up large amounts of property in the same areas, but they may not be bordering properties. So if you're just looking at the bordering properties, you may not find those families. But if you expand out and you're able to use the fan network, so you go to the neighbors' deeds and you look at those deeds, then you may find family that's bordering those neighbors' property. And so that's a really helpful way to use those land records, to use the cluster research of the fan network to figure out family in the area. So a really helpful resource when you're researching land records, not so much here in Virginia, but more towards the Midwest and out west, is the Bureau of Land Management and their general land office records. They have land patents and tract books and other records for land interactions between the federal government and individuals. And this is largely for, you know, those large tracts of land and smaller tracts of land when the country was expanding west. So it's very specific types of land records. But if you have people that you're researching that moved out into the Midwest or moved out into the plains, there's a good possibility that their land grants or their land patents may actually be available on this website. So this is an example of a federal land patent in Indiana, and this is a gentleman named John Boggs who lived in Ohio, and he was moving into Indiana. And so he made a purchase of land, and this is the final land patent saying that it's his. You can see that it was done through the Crawfordsville, Indiana land office. So you'll sometimes notice that like the general land offices were not in the specific exact region that the land was, but sometimes they are. And you can see that the land patent is actually has the name of the president of Martin Van Buren. So these land patents will have the standing president's name on them, which is kind of cool if you've got, you know, a piece of paper that has your ancestor's name and then the president's name on it. So the land patents are really helpful because they give very descriptive names or details of the land that you can then go track. And usually on the Bureau of Land Management page, you will have the one document and then you'll be able to click and see all of the other related documents to that same land, which is really helpful when you're tracking. And so you're able to see John Boggs' movement west because he was in Ohio and now he's moving into Indiana. So these are some other land records resources. As I mentioned, E. Wade Hohn's book is on here as well as a link to the land grants database on Library of Virginia. And I can't emphasize enough how helpful land records are when you're doing your fan network research or when you're tracing the history of a property or just trying to figure out where someone you're researching was at a specific time. If you're able to get those specific land records, they're very helpful in that research. Any land record questions?
Yes.
Okay.
So first, we do have a comment that somebody is related to the Boggs family
Oh, awesome.
from Ross County, Ohio. So this is very interesting. Always great when that
Well,
happens.
okay, so just so you know, there are a ton of records on the Boggs family at the Bureau of Land Management. So definitely head over there and you will find a lot more records related to your family.
Excellent. And then we had a question it has a big answer. So if you know the modern address of a property, are there tips to trace it back when there have been road name changes and property boundary changes? Sorry, I can't talk.
Yeah, so there are ways to do that. The best way to do that is to first of all figure out if you can figure out the road name changes. And the best way to do that is to kind of you know where you're generally located in your town and your county. And so try to identify um, the road name changes and uh, you can do that by looking at older maps and tracing it back. And then you can see if there are locally are any archaeological surveys or property histories in the area where your house is, or historic districts in the area that your house is, or even better, one for your house, that can get you started. And then you can also start tracing back the land deeds and the land grants and the land patents. The nice thing about the land records is you don't always need an address. Sometimes you just need a name. And so there are different ways to get that too. You can do a chain of title on your home, depending on how old your home is or how new your home is. There are different ways to do it. It also depends on where you live. Different counties, different states have different methods of doing that. But there are ways to track the addresses. Maps are very, you always want to start the maps, and there are different ways to track the names of your house, the previous owners, so you can kind of bypass the address. Here at the Balch, we have a lot of historic maps for the region that we use quite frequently to try and figure out the area so we can figure out the name changes. And then we're able to go from there to figure out what information we have on the area to figure out if we have specific information on the building itself. And it's really fun to try and figure out the property histories. So there are a lot of different ways to do it depending on what resources are available in your region. And as I said, depending on your region, there are different resources available for different regions. But there are definitely ways to do it. I would start with the maps to see if you can figure out what the previous road name was. And there are maps available online that you can do. You can do that as well, where you can trace back what it was previously. Any other questions?
Just a clarification about chain of title, that would be through the county clerk of court, right?
Yeah, that is
Excellent.
not something that we here at like a historical repository or anything like that can do. You would have to do that through the county. With the information that you get through your chain of title, we can help you do research on historic properties and names and things like that. Right. So next up is one of my favorite resources. I like all the resources, but I have some favorites, and city directories are one of my favorites. Um, City directories take on all different types of formats. So you never know what you're going to find in a city directory, and it depends on the year, it depends on the location. But in city directories, you have the potential to find the address, occupation, spouse, and real estate value of the person you're researching. Almost every city directory will have an abbreviation list at the front, so you will know what the entry means. This is the 1907 city directory for Lafayette, Indiana. And you can see that they have a really detailed abbreviation list at the front to indicate whether someone's bordering, like a border at the house they're in, whether they're a reverend, whether they are part of the rural free delivery for the Postal Service, part of the railway mail service, whether they're in West Lafayette, all of these different things. And so when you go and look over at the actual city directory, you can see that it is alphabetical by last name. You have both women and men listed. You can also see that for some of the women listed, it will list them and then it will list in parentheses that they're the widow of. It'll list their occupation and then it'll list where they reside, and it will list whether it's a house. And this is super helpful because, again, if you look at all the same last names. This is where you find those family groups, right? And this is how you figure out if you knew, for example, that you had a Charles A. Carnell, but you did not know his wife's name. Well, there's Ada Carnell listed as the widow of Charles A. And now you know that that was his wife's name. And it's a great way to find out occupations. It's in some places they not only list the occupation, but they also list the company that they worked at. It's also a really helpful way to track where people lived between the census. So the federal census is done every 10 years. Not every state did a census. In some cases, you're lucky they did a state census every 5 years, but not all states did that. So the city directories are between the census. You're lucky you get one every year. Sometimes you get them every 2 years. And it will give you the address that they lived at. So if they did move, you're able to track them. And it's really, really helpful to figure out where they are. One thing to note is that most city directories will contain the information from the prior year. So the 1907 directory will be the information that was gathered during 1906. So if someone dies after the process of gathering the directory information, they will still be listed in the 1907 directory, which is a little confusing. But that's just something to keep in mind. Similar to the census records, right? If someone dies after that census is enumerated, they're still going to appear on the census. All right, even though they, died in that same year of the census. So you also get street directories. This is from 1881 in Baltimore, Maryland. And it shows the streets and where they go. And in the really big streets, it will show you the numbers and the directions they go. So this kind of traces back to that question of the names changed. How do I trace the names? Street directories can be really helpful. So if you figure out what the name of the street was, you can kind of figure out where that street went and where it was located. So street directories were not in every location, but they were in some, and they're very helpful in trying to figure out where something was located, and maybe why it's not there anymore, because the street may not exist anymore. So here are some kind of just helpful tips on how to use a city directory, what city directories may be helpful for. They're real good with cluster research. They're real good with brick walls if you just can't find somebody. Especially again in that 10-year period between the census records. Try to find city directories. Not all city directories are available online, but you can definitely contact the local repositories in the area you're researching and ask if they have them available. It never hurts to say, hey, can you just do a quick search for me and see if this person's in this directory for this year? But there are city directories that are digitized and available online that you can look for. Be very wary of names that have been potentially jarbled in the attempts to get them in the index for city directories on databases. And so you may do a search and your person may not pop up as appearing in that city directory. But if you go to the specific collection and browse and look in a specific city directory for a specific year, you'll find that person's name. Because sometimes just the OCR scanning of city directories are a little bit difficult because you can see that text is not that great. So it never hurts to go and browse a city directory as opposed to just doing a straight search. And that's true of all records. If you just do a straight search and nobody comes up, but you're almost positive that person has to be in a document, just go and look at the document yourself and see if you can find them. So the last record type that I have to talk about for you is newspapers. This is another one of my favorites. I will never stop talking about newspapers and telling people to include them in their research. People go to newspapers for obituaries, but there are a ton of other things that you can find in them. Property announcements, advertisements. Here's an example of a letter list, which is, if when you had to go pick up your mail at the post office, some people wouldn't go get their mail. And so if it was left there long enough, they would put your name in the paper and tell you if you didn't come pick it up by a certain date, they would send it to the main post office as a dead letter. And this is a great way to figure out where your person was. It was also a great way to figure out if they didn't go get their mail. Also court cases. So, way back when, this is from 1839, they put way more information in newspapers than they could ever get away with today. So you would get detailed information on court cases. Social pages, you would know when somebody went to visit somebody, or when somebody had guests, or when they went to dinner, or where they went after church. And they would organize it by like town. So you would know on a certain week who was where. Going on vacation, they posted it in the newspaper. So the whole area would know you were gone for 4 months on a vacation, or you were going to stay with your kids for, 2 weeks. They would all know you were gone. But it also, again, it helps with that research and it helps you connect people. So it will explicitly say, so and so is going to stay with their daughter. So you can confirm that they're related. And then it also helps with the fan network because if they're having the same people over for Sunday Knitter every week, well, they're connected somehow. So how are they connected? Wedding announcements, birth announcements, obituaries. The newspapers were full of information because, again, they published everything. There was no privacy. Everything was in the papers. And so you can find everything. And what I said about searching before is true for newspapers as well. If you don't find your person's name in a newspaper that you think they should be in, just go and browse it, because the search may not have popped up that name. And the newspapers are really fun to read. You never know what you'll find in there. And again, you never know what connections you'll find because you may find the person you're researching in an advertisement with a business that you didn't know they were part of. Um, or you may find them associated with, a wedding announcement for someone you didn't know they were connected to. So those newspapers really tell you a whole lot of information that you wouldn't find in some of the other records. And so these are some newspaper resources. Another thing is Chronicling America, put out by the Library of Congress, is a website. It's free. It has a lot of the historical newspapers from around the country that you can search. And then Library of Virginia has the Virginia Chronicle, which has historical Virginia newspapers to search. And each state kind of has their own version of the Virginia Chronicle for their own historical newspapers that have been digitized for you to look at. So I definitely encourage you to go check out those resources as well to make sure that you are taking advantage of these digital resources that have been put out. And then again, check your libraries and your local repositories to see what databases they subscribe to with your um, local resources. They will definitely have access to other newspaper resources as well. Those are all of the records that I have to share with you today. So I will open it up for questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and start my video again so you're not staring at a blank wall. So any questions? I know I just threw a ton of information at you. And if you think of any questions, this was recorded and we're going to send out the slides. Give us a little time. It takes a minute. It actually takes like a day for the recording to upload. So you'll probably get the recording sometime tomorrow afternoon and we'll send out the slides with that too. If you are rewatching it or you're looking through the slides and you have questions, you have that Balch Lib email address, so don't hesitate to reach out with questions that you think of over the weekend or in the next few weeks, and we're happy to answer those questions. But if there aren't,
While we're waiting, just in case anybody's typing, I just want to pop in and apologize if anybody experienced audio issues. It seems like we had a couple places where the sound dropped a bit. Hopefully the recording caught all of that information. So, but apologies if you did have those issues.
I apologize that technology wasn't our friend. So again, if you are going over everything and you have questions, please do not hesitate to contact us.
Okay, so we have a question about what newspaper databases the Balch Library has.
Great question. So we have a couple. We have the newspapers.com World Collection, which is not everything on newspapers.com, but it is a large amount of it. And then we also have the ProQuest historical newspapers, which is a number of the historical newspapers. And then we also have Genealogy Bank, which has access to it. And one of our newest databases that we recently got is the America's Obituaries and Death Notices. So those are the databases that we have access to if you come here to the library. And then we also heavily use Chronicling America and Virginia Chronicle.
Um, Another question for you, Nora. What tips do you have for German ancestry research? I imagine you have some tips.
Yeah, did somebody see my last name? So German ancestry research is going to depend on your time period and your region, um, and whether you are researching Jewish German or Christian German. Um, but my biggest recommendation is going to be to go to the Family Search Research Wiki. And if you just go to Google and type in Family Search Research Wiki, it will be the first uh, result. And you don't need to create a Family Search account to do this. And type in the region of Germany that you are researching. It will pop up a page for that region, and it will give you a history of the region and when it changed hands and when it was part of another country and when it was part of Germany. And then it will give you a list of the records for that region and where they're located. So the tricky thing about German research is Germany wasn't unified until the 1870s. And then, so you've got, where was that region before? And then after that, it doesn't have like a national archives like we do. And so each um, region and province has its own archives. And then you have the church archives, and each region and province holds their archives in different locations. So some of them are at the town level, and some of them are at the regional level, and then some of them have moved. And so the research wiki will tell you where the different types of records you're looking for are kept for that region and whether any of them are digitized. Unfortunately, a lot of the German records are not digitized. They're working on it. Some of the regions are more digitized than others. And so for a lot of the German research, you do have to contact the repositories. Um, but the reason I recommend the Family Search Research Wiki is it does tell you for each region, is there anything online and is it behind a paywall and what years are available online? And then, or do I need to contact the actual repository? And then if you are researching anyone from Germany who came over to the United States, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th. Definitely check out so there are outgoing passenger manifests for Hamburg, and some of them are digitized. And then some of those Germans went through England, so you can check the UK outward passenger manifests because they'll be on there. Especially if you're researching people that left Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. Um, and but my biggest recommendation is to figure out what's available for the region. That you can't really go anywhere until you figure that out. If you're researching Jewish Germans, um, email me at Balchlib because that's a little bit more in depth, and I'd be glad to help you.
Okay, we've had a few follow-up questions for
Okay.
that. One, sorry. It scrolled away. Um, Somebody mentions that they've had a lot of difficulty finding the German region because of lost records.
Mhm.
And any recommendations of other places to look? You kind of touched on it, but in that particular instance.
So, I'm gonna share my screen again real quick. See, the first name on the Newport resources list, James M. Beidler. Not only did he write the Family Tree Historical Newspapers Guide, but he wrote a family tree guide on German research. And he also did a German historical atlas for Family Tree. And I cannot recommend both of those resources enough. If you're doing German research, he's just really good. He's a really good resource. But both of those resources are really good in terms of trying to figure out changes and things like that. But the Family Search Research Wiki is going to talk about lost records and like what gaps are missing and things like that. Um, there, unfortunately, with Germany and you know, Central and Eastern Europe in general, there are some records that have been lost that we just don't know about. Um, and so you will run into that as well. Um, but Germany is doing a fairly good job of trying to fill in, where those records have been lost and trying to find other ways to get that information. But again, most of it has not been digitized, so a lot of it's on the ground.
Um, Somebody said that they met him at a conference. That's about his books, and they are helpful. And we did have Mr. Bigler as a speaker here a few years back, and
Yeah.
it was a great program. So I do recommend his information. We have a similar question. Someone says that her grandmother said her parents only came from Germany. She was born here, but she didn't give additional names for her parents other than the last name. Is there a good resource to sort of locate names in or regions in Germany based on names? Is that, in your experience, any thoughts?
No. Um, I'm in the same boat, so I sympathize. Um, there there are websites for German surnames that you can go and plug them in to see like what regions they're most likely from. And can you email balchlib at leesburgva.gov, the email address that's in the emails we sent you, and I will find you resources because I know them. I just don't know them off the top of my head. Um, but I can give you resources if you send an email to Balchlib. Um, because there are some websites that I can send you to. Um, or it looks like a lot of people have this question, and so maybe I'll do a Facebook post. um, but yeah, if you ask that question about surnames in Germany, please send an email to Baltlib. And or if any of you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to email balchlib at leesburgva.gov. It was the email address in the emails that we sent you over the last few days, and we would be thrilled to help you. And I am now contemplating a German research class in my head, so thank you. Any other questions?
That's a great idea. We did get a comment, a recommendation for as a German resource is the Pennsylvania German Society in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. Um, and then if we could just close, Nora, by touching on the library's current access. So we did have a question about if we're open without appointments, which yay, we are. And also just maybe our web address, which I'll put in the comments, maybe while you
Sure. Laura's going to put our web address in the comments because it's real long. Um, So we are at the Thomas Balch Library currently open without appointments, and we are so excited to welcome you all back. Currently, our hours are Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We do close for lunch from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. And on Wednesdays, we are open from 2 p.m. to 7:30. And those are our current hours. Please follow our website and our social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for any announcements on changes to our hours, and any announcements on exhibits, upcoming classes. We're very active on social media. So please monitor social media and our website for any upcoming classes, any upcoming exhibits, and anything else that may be going on. But again, our current hours are Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., closed for lunch from 12 to 1. And on Wednesdays, we're open from 2 to 7:30. And thanks so much for joining us. And if you have any other questions, we are here Monday through Friday and available to answer your questions, and we'd be thrilled to help you.
Great. Well, thank you, Nora, for a really informative presentation. And again, if you had any more questions and we missed them, we will send you an email response. So, but thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us for future programs.